Yeah, guten Tag erstmal. So thank you all for helping to celebrate our German-American Day, right? October 6th. Why are we celebrating this day again, dear students? Yeah?
Because that's when the township in Pennsylvania, the first German immigrants was established.
Yeah, does somebody remember how many they were and which city they came from?
Sorry.
Nobody read the flyer, huh? 13 from Krefeld, that's right. And so we have today Dr. Don Heinrich Tolzmann with us. He's the author and editor of numerous German-American history and culture books, really. Yes, I think that is definitely worth it. He has received also multiple awards, including the Federal Cross of Merit. I didn't even know that. It's the Bundesverdienstkreuz, yeah, das Bundesverdienstkreuz. And at the University of Cincinnati, he served as a curator for the German-Americana collection and director of the German-American Studies. And he is currently president of the German-American Citizen League and the German Heritage Museum, which I hope to take you all to in spring again. Some of you also know Don from the Over the Rhine tours we take with him. Who remembers those? Yeah, I thought a couple of you were on those tours as well, right? Where we learn more about the architecture and so on. So you kind of know Don already. So I would like to say a big thank you to the sponsors of this event, which is the College of Arts and Sciences and the Department of World Languages and Literatures. And the embassy, the German embassy in Washington was so kind and also kicked in some swag. So please do not leave swagless before you go. Grab a couple of things. We have too many actually, so please take stuff. And yeah, please help me welcome Dr. Don Heinrich Tolzmann.
Thank you, Dr. Feiler, for the invitation. And I want to applaud you for all you do for the German language and culture. She has just been a wonderful gem here in our area. So today I want to talk about Kentucky's German element and heritage, and something about the terms. By German element, I refer to the German-speaking immigrants and their descendants. And so it's not confined to the immigrant generation alone, it's multi-generational. And their homelands can be Germany, Austria, Switzerland, or any of the German-speaking countries in Europe. Next.
I did next.
Das weiter.
Ja, ich weiß. Jetzt will wieder, wollte gerade nicht, sorry.
Okay, here we see a census map where people of German background live. And Kentucky is usually not thought of as a German heritage state, but it's the population of German descent ancestry is rather large, 22%. Not as large as in Ohio, where it's 40%, but it is substantial. And I think the question arises, why do we not think of Kentucky as a German heritage state? And there's a couple of reasons. An entry in the Kentucky Encyclopedia explains that, quote, the usual conception of the pioneer population of Kentucky does not include recognition of the noteworthy German element. Popular lore in both scholarly and popular literature have established the stereotype of the Appalachian Anglo-Saxon, retaining traces of Elizabethan speech with a possible admixture of Scotch-Irish, unquote. So the popular image of the early settlers of Kentucky does not include the German dimension. And there's some other factors too that come into play. Early on, German people were called by non-Germans Dutch. And this goes back to the colonial time when non-Germans confused the word Deutsch with Dutch. Also, early on, German names were anglicized or translated into English, such as Zimmermann became carpenter. So Germans are often not identified as such in the historical literature, and their names are often misspelled or translated in English language sources. So that makes research for somebody like me difficult. Another factor that is important is the anti-German hysteria and sentiment of two world wars. During World War I, many libraries eliminated their German language books, newspapers, publications. For example, the libraries of Northern Kentucky, the public libraries, they got rid of all their German materials, eliminated everything. So it was not really until after World War II, well after World War II, that people started to celebrate German heritage once again. However, due to the factors that I've mentioned, research that I do on German heritage is difficult, especially because in an estimable amount of the historical record consisting of primary source materials is irretrievably lost. So given that caveat, we can proceed to the topic and begin by looking at the region we're in, the Ohio River Valley. And here you see how big the Ohio River Valley is, including not only the river, but all the streams and tributaries that feed into the Ohio River. And when Germans came to this region, they settled along rivers and streams. They preferred the locations there because it was good for travel, trade, commerce, and the land was rich. Next. And here we see the Cumberland Gap, and settlers from the east got to Kentucky before the American Revolution via the Cumberland Gap. This brought them across the Wilderness Road, as you can see in the bottom there. It was built by Daniel Boone and his followers, and brought them into this area. Next. In 1775, Daniel Boone brought his family and a group of settlers into Kentucky. They built a stockade, maybe some of you have visited, which became known as Boone's Borough. Boone was born in Berks County, Pennsylvania, an area heavily settled by Germans. Not surprisingly, he was fluent in the Pennsylvania German dialect. And amongst these early settlers who came with him were Pennsylvania Germans. And as a matter of fact, his best friend was a Pennsylvania German by the name of Steiner, who in the historical literature is often referred to as Stoner. But his real name, of course, was Steiner. These early Pennsylvania Germans were erroneously called Pennsylvania Dutch, but of course, they were not Dutch, but Deutsch. Next. This is the gravestone of Abraham Lincoln's grandfather, and you might note the spelling, Linkhorn. His family came to Jefferson County near Louisville and settled there. And it's about 20 miles from Louisville. And they came over the Cumberland Gap with a group of people. And they were from Rockingham County, Virginia, another area that was heavily settled by Germans. And due to that, his grandfather spelled his name as it would be spelled in German, because in German, they pronounce his name Linkhorn, which sounded like Lincoln. So it showed the great influence that was had by people who were not of German descent, but they lived around people who were German speaking. Next. And I'm going to be mentioning a lot of books in here, and I hope some of you might look into them. Some of them are by works that I have published, but deal with a German heritage that you might want to take a look at. Well, early on, because of Lincoln's family being spelled Linkhorn, the question always arose, was he of German descent? And so a book was published by Marion Dexter Learned, and it went out of print. And I kept getting questions too. Was Lincoln, did he have any German ancestry? And so I re-edited and brought it out for publication again. And I also added an appendix dealing with Boone, because I also got a lot of questions about him since he spoke German. Both of them, of course, were of English descent, but they show a lot of German influence in their family. Next. Well, when Germans started moving into our area, again, you know, they settled along rivers and streams. So throughout the tri-state area, they settled very densely into this area. Next. One of the early Pennsylvania German settlements is to the east on the Ohio River, Germantown, which is named for Germantown in Pennsylvania. And it was settled in 1788. And of course, reminds us of Germantown, Pennsylvania. Was settled here by the 1790s, was pretty much filled up with Pennsylvania Germans in this settlement. And this is another example of something that needs to be researched. I don't think the history of this town and the migration of Pennsylvania Germans into this area has been researched, and it's something that really should be done. Another example is on the next picture is Muhlenberg County in the western part of the state, which was named for a Revolutionary War general, Peter Muhlenberg, who was, of course, of German stock himself. And the soldiers who served in his regiment after the revolution moved into Kentucky. They settled in that county, and they named the county for him. The reason why all these soldiers were moving west was because after the American Revolution, the federal government was almost bankrupt. So they couldn't provide pensions. So they gave land grants to the soldiers, and they gave a large piece of land to soldiers that settled in that area. This is another interesting thing, that a topic that hasn't been researched, the history of Muhlenberg County. It'd be an interesting topic. Next. Another interesting influx of German settlers came from Germana in Virginia. This was founded early in the 1700s by German immigrants principally from North Rhine-Westphalia. And a group of the settlers from that area came to our area and settled in Boone County in the early 1800s. And they founded a church there, Hopeful Lutheran Church, the first Lutheran church west of the Allegheny Mountains. And they attracted many other Germans came there, as well as non-Germans came to that settlement. And right around that church, a settlement grew up that became Florence, Kentucky. Florence, Kentucky goes back to a German settlement. A lot of these Germans came down the Ohio River, but some of them came on the Conestoga wagon that you see shown here. Next. They also brought with them what became known as the Kentucky rifle, which was something that they perfected during the American Revolution. And was perfected by and built by German gunsmiths in Pennsylvania, and more correctly should be called a Pennsylvania German rifle, but is more commonly known as a Kentucky rifle. This is a masthead from a German-American historical journal published in Cincinnati called Der Deutsche Pionier, the German Pioneer. And it's really a gold mine of information on local history, and especially our region. It was edited by Heinrich Tolzmann, and he published several articles dealing with German immigration and settlement in Kentucky. Next. And I translated them and put them together for this book on the German pioneers of Kentucky. And so you're interested in this early period, this is the place to go to and look for information. Next. Martin Baum is considered the father of the German immigration to the Ohio River Valley. He was born in Alsace, came to Cincinnati in 1795. He opened a lot of businesses, such as a bank, a sugar refinery, an iron foundry. And he sent agents to port cities, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and New Orleans to attract German immigrants to our area. And he's really responsible for creating a reputation for Cincinnati and our area as a place where German immigrants should come to settle and come to. Next. And this was his home, it's now the Taft Museum of Art. Baum really became the wealthiest man in the West at his time. He was really a self-made man. He came as an immigrant from Alsace with basically nothing. And because of all these businesses and companies that he had, he became the richest man in the West. And he attracted a lot of Germans also to come to our area because they looked at him and said, if this man can rise from rags to riches, maybe we can also. So he was a tremendous role. And here's another book that would be a point of departure, would be on Covington's German heritage. Covington was organized in 1815, and it attracted not only this early stream of Pennsylvania Germans, but also Germans coming now directly from Europe. And German immigration really began after the Napoleonic Wars, after 1815, because before that, for about 20 years, with all the wars in Europe, immigration basically was cut off. Next. And there are books dealing on the Germans in Louisville. There are two that are really quite well done. One on to the left on immigration and settlement, and the one to the right dealing with German influences. Next. There also is an interesting book on two neighborhoods in Louisville, Germantown and Schnitzelburg. And I think this is a good example of a German inner city neighborhood. Here in our area, we often think of the Over the Rhine district. Well, Louisville did have two little German districts, so they're very interesting. Charles Sealsfield is another person I want to mention, a very interesting German-American author in the first half of the 19th century. His real name was Karl Anton Postel, and he wrote under a pseudonym and published many books about America. And one of them he published was Die Vereinigten Staaten von Nordamerika. And it was translated in English as The Germans as They Are. And it includes discussion, a chapter on Kentucky. And he writes, quote, Kentucky is without the least exaggeration, one of the finest districts on the face of the earth. The climate is equal to that of the south of France. Fruits of every kind arrive at the highest perfection. The only negative comment that he had was that Kentucky was plagued as a slave state. But his books were bestsellers. They were widely published and circulated in the German states and translated in English. But these were the kinds of things, books like this, that were being read in Germany, and people would become interested then in immigration. Next. Of course, there are German immigrant letters. When people came here, they would write to friends and family and attract more people to come to the area. So we're still looking for immigrant letters. that we can find because they provide information on their views and perceptions of what life was like here. Next. German-American newspapers are very important. The major German paper in Kentucky was the Louisville Anzeiger. And for our area, the Cincinnati Volksblatt is very important. It covers not only Cincinnati, but northern Kentucky. And they've been microfilmed and they're available for research. Another topic to look at is Germans in the Civil War. German regiments were formed in our area early on. They were all formed in Cincinnati because at the beginning of the Civil War, Kentucky was neutral and was a slave state. But then when the Confederate forces moved into Kentucky, it did flip and become a Union state. But this is a book I translated that deals on the role played by the different German regiments in the area. Something that would be of interest if you're wanting to look at the Civil War period. Next. Of course, we have the Roebling Suspension Bridge that opened right after the Civil War in 1867. And it was built by a German immigrant, John Roebling, who went on from here to design the Brooklyn Bridge. Many of the Germans in our area worked on the construction of this bridge, and Roebling definitely had a preference for German workers and thought they were very reliable. This is a book I put out on him if you're interested in looking into his life. He worked very hard. I don't know if any of you have been to the Roebling Point bookstore in Covington. That is exactly where Roebling had his office and where he worked, which was quite near the bridge. He did in the evening in his spare time, I guess he did have spare time, and he would go across the river to over the Rhine, and he'd enjoy the beer gardens there. It said that he'd like to have a glass of beer or a glass of wine. Next. And speaking of beer, of course, the biggest brewery in not only in northern Kentucky, but in Kentucky altogether was the Wiedemann Brewery. It was the largest south of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi, the whole South. This was the biggest brewery. It was founded by a German immigrant from Thuringia, which was not far from the home of Roebling. And I've often wondered, since they were here at the same time, did they ever see each other or rub shoulders in one of the beer gardens? But I haven't been able to find that out, if that ever did actually happen. Next. And there is a book on him and his brewing history here. He did work initially in a brewery in the Over the Rhine district, and then at a certain point, I think he realized, wait a minute, there's no breweries in northern Kentucky. There's a lot of Germans there. So I think I'll go across to Newport and start a brewery, which he did in 1870. And the rest is history. It became a major brewery. And he founded actually a brewing dynasty. Here he is shown on the left with his two sons. And the family continued brewing really well into the 20th century until after World War II. It was then later sold, but the name has been resurfaced with a new owner. Unfortunately, not located in Newport, but still the name is still here. And this is an example of some of the other smaller breweries that were in Covington. There's the Covington Brewery on the left, and then there's the Bavarian Brewery. So there were quite a few other breweries in the state as well. Bernstadt in Laurel County is in southern Kentucky. It was a Swiss settlement. And here we see a Swiss family and the Swiss Colony Church. They started a little colony, and there's another topic that might be researched is the history of Swiss immigration to Kentucky, and then particularly to Bernstadt. Next. William Goebel, he was the son of German immigrants and one of the leading politicians in northern Kentucky. He lived in Covington. He was a very controversial figure. His father had served in the Union Army, so he was very outspoken in supporting the Union cause with regard to the Civil War. And in 1895, he got into a discussion, an argument with a Confederate general in Covington. They engaged in a duel, and the Confederate general was killed. He got off by claiming self-defense, but he was detested by Confederate-minded Kentuckians. And keep in mind, this was only about 30 years after the Civil War, and there were a lot of Confederate-minded people in the southern part of the state, and a sprinkling of them also in our area as well. He did become governor in 1900, and I think he was the only governor of Kentucky who was German-American. He served only 4 days, and he died tragically after being shot by an assassin. So he's a very controversial but interesting figure. Next. There was a German-American state alliance, a federation of German societies in the state of Kentucky. Was formed in the early 1900s. And the head of it was this fellow Alban Wolf, who had his headquarters at his printing company in Covington. There was a German printing shop there that he was in charge of. This is a marker regarding World War I, and I did mention the negative impact of that on research, the loss of a lot of library materials. And this is a sign that was put up on what was Raymond Street in Covington to remind us of what happened during the First World War. And this is something that I've written a lot about in some of my books, what happened at that time. There was streets also in Newport were changed. This was German Street and was changed to Liberty Street. So a sign was put up there recently to remind us of what happened. Next. And throughout the area, this is an example in Covington, a lot of businesses throughout this area had German names or were actually in auf Deutsch, or they had German within the name. This was the German National Bank in Covington. And there's the building as it looks today. It was founded unavoidable. It had to change its name. It became the Liberty National Bank. Thanks. So today, there are still a number of German societies in the state of Kentucky. The German-American Club of Louisville is probably the largest in the state. Next. And they do sponsor a lot of festivities. Oktoberfest, for example. Next. And in our area, the largest society of German heritage is the Covington Turnverein. It's another interesting organization. It goes back to 1855. Its history hasn't been written. It'd be interesting to see it written to learn more about people who founded it. It's located in the Covington Mainstrasse village. Next. And in the Mainstrasse village, you find the Mutter Gottes Kirche, the Mother of God Church, which was the mother church for all of the German Catholic churches in northern Kentucky. They all go back to this church. And in 2016, it celebrated its 175th anniversary, and it had a German mass. And this was the founding priest, Ferdinand Curator, and he was from North Rhine-Westphalia. Like many of the German immigrants to northern Kentucky, they predominantly came from northern Germany. Next. And one of the parishioners there was the well-known artist, Frank Duveneck. And there's an interesting biography of him, if you're interested in art. He started working in churches here, doing wood carving, painting. He went to Munich, studied at the Art Academy, and came back here. And then he taught at the Cincinnati Art Academy for many years. Next. Yeah. And another artist who's also buried at the same cemetery as Duveneck, the Mother of God Church, is really an outstanding sculptor. His name is Clement Barnhorn. And he did this beautiful work of art sculpture at the cemetery. The title is Ich bin die Auferstehung. I am the resurrection. He also did sculptures at the Cathedral Basilica, Memorial Hall, and over the Rhine, and many other works of art throughout the area. Another fascinating person who should be researched. Next. Of course, Mainstrasse Village in Covington really honors the German heritage of that town. I mentioned the population of Kentucky, 22% of German background. In Covington, the population, 40% of German heritage, pretty much like across the river in Ohio. Next. Does anybody like Goethe? There are a few people. If this is a popular food item in our area, I'm not sure if
I don't know why.
It's relatively unknown outside of our area. And if you go to Germany, it's relatively unknown also because it only comes from a very distinct area of northwest Germany. It's an area next that I call Goethe country. Goethe country, where you see the Kingdom of Hanover and part of Westphalia, this whole northwest corner. This is the region from which many immigrants came to our area, the greater Cincinnati area, more than 50%. Goethe, the word itself is not, it has different names too in Germany. The name itself it comes from a Low German word, Gottwurst. And so anybody who speaks High German would have never heard of that word. But the High German word would be Gritzwurst, grits and sausage. So, but it's kind of a food marker relating to where people come from. There's a lot of interesting stories about from locals here. We'll go to Munich and they'll say, well, they want some Goethe and eggs. And they'll say, well, what the heck is that? I've never heard of it. And they will even deny and argue with you that it's not German. That's because it's not a national food. It's a very regional food from that northwest corner. Next. Another interesting area nearby is Camp Springs in Campbell County. It was settled by Germans from the Rhineland area. And this is why Campbell County has so many wineries. And there's some very many interesting example of German style architecture, fieldstone barns and outbuildings through that area. Just a fascinating material to look at. Next. Where can you go for further research? You can go to the University of Cincinnati, and there is a German-Americana collection there. I think that was mentioned earlier, but there's a lot of materials that can be found there relating to local history. Next. There are a couple of biographical indexes for if you're looking for information on a certain person or tracing genealogy. These two books index all the German materials that were published for our area. And if you're interested in tracing somebody's background, you might look there, or you're researching a certain person. Next. Then there are a couple other books I would point out. One is the German Element in the Ohio Valley, covers Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. That was published in Cincinnati in 1880, and I translated that. There's a book on the right that deals also with the Ohio River Valley. Next. There's an older work that translation came out in the 1990s. It was published in 1864 and covers the period before the Civil War very well. Next. And here's an autobiography of a post-war German immigrant, Matthias Turban. I think he's probably more well known as Matt Tobin locally, but he came here with, I think he told me $10 in his pocket. He came here, lived with a relative, and he built a huge construction business in our area. Built many homes and subdivisions throughout northern Kentucky. He has a fascinating autobiography about his life story, about what it was like growing up in Germany during World War II, where conditions were like after the war, and then coming to northern Kentucky. So it's a reminder too that German immigration is not just a thing of the past, not going back to the colonial period, the 19th century. People continue to come up to our region after World War II and even recently. Next. And if you want to take a look at my most recent book, I do cover the greater Cincinnati area. You've got a wealth of material to look at, and this covers only the greater Cincinnati area, not the whole Kentucky area. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is in a nutshell, is a look at Kentucky's German element and heritage, and some of the books and things you can turn to, topics you can look into, and people you might want to research. And thank you again, Dr. Filer, for the invitation. I do appreciate that very much.
Miss Nancy Myers wrote on Zoom, maybe you can help us. She says it sounds similar to what we call Pinkelwurst.
Yes, that's the same thing.
The same thing.
That's the same thing. And like I said, Goethe, it has different names. In Bremen, it's called Knip. And so it has a wide variety of names. And it just happened, maybe the people that came here were from a certain village or area that they used that Low German word. And again, that people not knowing Plattdeutsch would not understand at all with that. And I might ask Dr. Filer if you like Goethe.
I do not. And I was one of those Germans that fought with Americans saying this is not a German dish until I learned, I think it was from you, that indeed it is. I just don't know it.
Which is very localized. And we hear this all the time when Bavarians come here.
Yeah.
You know, they're used to Weisswurst and Bratwurst.
Yeah.
Not Gutwurst.
This happened. You had a question earlier.
Yeah, so is Berg means bush?
Could you speak?
Pardon?
Berg means bush, right?
A berg is a mountain.
Yeah.
So is that like, is Gatlinburg also German? Like, is that
Gatlinburg.
Yeah.
That suffix is German. So it's something that I haven't really researched or looked into, but it probably likely is. Because there was that early influx that I mentioned that came with Boone's at the Cumberland Gap, Boonesboro, Lexington. What is the capital of the state of Kentucky? Frankfurt. A German name. Germans settled there also. They were part of that early migration to Kentucky. They gave people often don't make that connection to the state capital. But it's pretty, and this whole early wave that I talked about was very influential early on, and is probably completely overlooked as a rule. People think about German immigration directly from Europe, 1830s, 40s, and 50s, and they overlook this early wave that was very important throughout the area.
Any other questions?
Scata.
It's pinhead oats with pork, sometimes beef, onion, spices. This is lekker.
Nice.
That's very greasy.
We could have brought some
Probably
of
like
these
this.
here.
Or
It varies by manufacturer. I mean, there's a lot of homemade, a lot of like 3 or 4 companies make it commercially.
It fills you up because it is inexpensive because it's made mostly, or half of it's oatmeal. So, you know, if you had to go work hard in the field, it was something to eat.
I think it was probably also a way of stretching meat.
it
I'm
was.
guessing, right? Because
They're-
we're really good as
You're
Germans
right.
at stretching meat. That is something we mastered.
Stretching things out.
Yeah.
There is a
Use the
public
You say meat with,
You could use the snout.
Sorry, what were you saying?
there is a published book on Ghana.
Yeah, I would hope so, I guess.
It took some time. It's a recent publication.
All right, very cool. Do you know?
I can't remember the author. I can bring it in though.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe I just haven't had the right Goethe. How about that? Yeah, I'm open to that option. Yes.
I'll treat you to some.
Okay, there we go. Okay, any other questions? Again, I thank you all for being there, and again, special thanks to Dawn. Thank you to the Zoom crew too.